I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to our panel on liberal Zionism, Jewish pluralism, and democracy. I'm Rabbi Jan Urbach. I'm the director of the Block Holker Center for Spiritual Arts here at JTS. I'm also a congregational rabbi, and I'll be moderating our panel. I would like to just take a moment to thank Abigail Moore and Len Wasserman. I see Len here for generously sponsoring our panel today. And just to give you an overview of our plan for our time together, and then I will introduce our wonderful panelists. So each of our panelists is going to speak for about 15 minutes. We're going to break up the pattern a little bit, and they're going to speak from the podium, and hopefully that will really give us good, clear audio. Followed by what we hope will be some lively discussion among them, and we've reserved plenty of time at the end for your questions. So I'm just going to dive right in and introduce our panelists, beginning in the middle with Dr. Alon Schwarz, who is the director of the Shacharit Institute, a think and do tank promoting the common good in Israeli society. Shacharit strives to bridge the divides of Israeli society that threaten its shared future between secular religious and Haredim, between Jews and Arabs, between haves and have-nots, and centrally between the political left, center, and right. Shacharit combines forward-thinking ideas and policy work, multicultural leadership, and local community training that brings diverse people together in collective action. Alon is also a faculty member and award-winning teacher at the Melton Center for Jewish Education at Hebrew University, where he teaches advanced studies, seminars in cultural criticism, tensions between liberal and non-liberal identities, and educational philosophy. He's written numerous academic and popular articles on similar subjects and their educational and political implications. He's done a lot of other wonderful things and served on some boards. And very proudly, I'm happy to say, holds 2 bachelor degrees, one from Columbia and one from JTS right here, as well as a doctorate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So why don't we begin there, and I'll introduce each of you separately. So, Alon.
Hi, everybody. And if I'm not speaking into the microphone, just raise a hand. Give me a signal, but I think we'll be okay. The transition from the last session to this is not easy for me. So I just want to say something about the last session. I think a feeling that many of us have, also I think many of you and certainly Israelis, this need to give testimony in some way. So I just want to share that I was 2 or 3 days before we came here, I was down in Ofakim. Ofakim is basically in the Otef, in the envelope that's there. And I was there for a evening that I didn't really knew existed in the Jewish tradition until last year, which is that there's a tikkun, Hoshana Rabbah. I don't know if many of you knew about that. Nobody told me about this, but I got invited a year ago to that tikkun, where the person who was running it, Moshe Ochion, who was the chairman of the Shacharit board, invited pairs of people to teach, basically from midnight till 5 a.m., who come from different parts of the political map. I taught with Rabbi Avi Gieser, who's from Sohar, which is a group of Orthodox rabbis that are there, and that was last year. 24 hours later, Moshe and his son were sadly murdered. They were on the first line in Ofakim that were there, and about 5 days ago, we had a reunion of all the people that had taught there, and that came together to both to acknowledge his memory, but also something that I think is in Hebrew we say metaltel. It confuses one, because as a result of his death, his murder, there are today all of these initiatives in Israel that are in his memory. And as his parents say to me, these lovely people said to me, we didn't know. We didn't know he was like that. We didn't know that he did all of these things. And so it's this very kind of painful and confusing and piece of the fact that in his murder, it opened up all sorts of things that led to understanding him in ways that didn't. Of course, we wish that he never would have been killed, but on the other hand, to be there in that group of people with his widow and with his children, and to feel his presence was something that was very important and very special. So when Moshe is sitting there talking about, in a beautiful way, by the way, for me, particularly the moral kind of dilemmas of a war. I think of those things. I think of my kids. One just got out of the army. One is in Miluim right now. None of them in combat. None of them in danger. But all of them with their souls inside of all of this. What the hell am I doing in Israel? I grew up in Levittown, a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary. My mother claims that I decided to move to Israel when I was in 4th grade. I fell in love with Israel. I call it the Israel of the 70s, right? I loved Amos Oz, who already had some translations that were out there. I loved Yehuda Amichai because it was the only poetry that you could read and understand. It was accessible, it was understandable, the language was clear. I loved Kaveret, Pugi, right? That irreverent moment after the Yom Kippur War. Went to a reunion concert a few years back with my kids who were little at the time on our shoulders, and you saw all these generations of a group of people that grew up on Pugi, now with their kids in arm and doing that together. I loved the Friday afternoon drive on an Egged bus to visit my relatives at Kibbutz Be'eri. They're fine. And the sound and the smells of the dirt kicking up and the dry air that goes around it. I loved all of these things. I loved them partially because of my parents. My parents moved to Israel in 1949. My mom was born in Kishinev and came at the age of 3 to the United States. My father was born in the United States. They were on the first boat out of the New York harbor after the War of Independence and moved to Israel. My mother had a set of letters. Shirley and I were talking about it for a minute because her own background plays to that. And my parents, those were the stories that I grew up on. I gathered together a set of books, and because Shirley read what she did, I felt obligated to read something of my mother's from the letters that she wrote. So this is a very short piece from letters that my mother brought back together after she went back to the States and gathered them from her parents and from her sister. And this is the letter of her arrival in the Haifa Bay as they were arriving on the boat. Wednesday morning was the great day in our lives. Rumor had it that we were approaching Haifa, and everyone was up bright and early, anxiously anticipating the event. We were on deck, straining our eyes for some image, and finally the image started to take form in the shape of the Mount Carmel. Then slowly we came closer and closer to the mountain, and the shape of the harbor started to take form. The captain of the ship summoned all passengers on deck, while the crew hoisted up the Israeli flag. What a thrill that was, everyone standing side by side, singing the Hatikvah, while the blue and white colors flew over the blue Mediterranean waters. Closer and closer we came, with the Carmel pulling us like a magnet towards the shores of Israel. Now we could make out ships in the dock, houses and buildings in the background, and finally people standing in the gates of the pier, ready to greet the newcomers. One of the people that were waiting for my parents was my mother's aunt, my grandfather's sister. My grandfather came from a family that, after surviving childbirth, they were 4 siblings, sort of like Fiddler on the Roof, but in a different kind of narrative. 2 of them went to Palestine in 1923. One stayed in the Soviet Union, married a communist official, and they raised their kids there. Those children and her descendants made their way to Israel in the big Aliyah in the beginning of the 1990s. And my grandfather, at my grandmother's urging, said, they can go to Palestine, we're going to the United States, not to Denver, to Brooklyn. And since then, my grandfather was a Hebrew teacher. One of the iconic pictures that we have is Chaim Nachman Bialik came to the United States one time in 1926, and we have a picture of my grandfather with Bialik together. That's a family heirloom. So the fact that I fell in love with Israel in the 1970s is not surprising. Oh, by the way, and my grandfather spoke only Hebrew to my aunt for 5 years until my grandmother finally told him it was probably not the best idea. So it's no surprise that I fell in love with Israel of the 1970s. It was kind of writ in the cards. When my mother said I fell in love with Israel and ready to make Aliyah, I was in 4th grade, she knew that story. The dramatic tale that I tell, and it's over-dramatized a bit, that Israel is gone. That Israel is over. The crisis that exists between this room, from what I've listened to the conversation, Israel is that crisis. Is the crisis that there was an Israel that liberal Jews loved because it was the same family. Literally. These were my grandfather's siblings and their children. My cousins on Kibbutz Be'eri came from that place. And I loved it for the sameness. It wasn't completely the same. They had this thing about Jewish tradition, far more secular, far more anti, right? That always caused a little bit of tension, but a little bit of tension. But basically, we were part of that. I'll say the last thing about this to kind of like hammer it back is that in 1977, there was the Mapach. The Likud went to power. Menachem Begin was elected prime minister. And I was on the Young Judea Year course, and as part of the role that I felt was part of what I did, is there a camera here? I burnt Menachem Begin's picture in my room and left a stain, by the way. Such were the dynamics. But what happened in 1977 is that there were these other voices of Israeli society that had been there all along. And because of all sorts of reasons that took place, those voices made its way into the public square with their own demands about what Israel should be like and what Israel should look like. We call it in our business, we call it deep diversity. When I say deep diversity, I mean that different visions of Israel, different visions of Judaism, different visions of what it means to be human in the world, different visions of what education should look like, different visions of all of these pieces. And all of that stuff came bursting out in a certain way, in a beautiful way. Right? There are those that mourn that loss. There are those that celebrate that loss. But Israel changed. The old guard will sometimes say, Aviv Geffen just said it recently, they stole from us the country. Right? That still sense of entitlement, that somehow it's ours. But there are these other voices that were out there. Those other voices have been from the beginning, and increasingly today, seen as problematic by the liberal camp. Before October 7th, we forget, we had the judicial reform. And the judicial reform was driven politically and not otherwise by many who within the liberal camp saw it as a clear and present danger to Israeli democracy as we know it. And so this old hegemony also reasserted itself in protests that filled the streets. And I think you can witness if you're not, I think it excited people in the worlds that I live in. I live in Tel Aviv. It's the bubble of the bubble of the bubble. Everybody would walk to the protests with flag in hand to protest. To protest in a feeling of standing up and holding on to the country as we knew it, as we wanted it. The struggle of Israel is this exact struggle. It's the struggle of what do you do when you have conflicting visions of a place? And those conflicting visions of a place are at loggerheads often, not always, but at loggerheads with one another. How do we see those other things? Do we see them as threats? Do we see them as turning the country into a dark, racist state that's out there? How do we find the space between making room and also drawing lines? How do we navigate those places within it? So I'd like to say quickly that I think that there are really only two options. One is the option of trying to get people to be more like us. That option has not been working well.
Could you say
like
that again?
Like us, I'm saying in quotes, the liberal camp. We need to turn the rest of Israel into being more liberal like we are. There's some things that are fine, innocuous, al tam v'reach, lo litvakeach. But on the core values of the country, we need them to move over to our camp. It's not a great strategy. It's not a great strategy for all sorts of reasons, mostly because no one wants to be converted. No one wants to abandon the things that are the most important to them, which are also the things that threaten. And the other option, as far as I can tell, as far as I can say, and it's a lot of what I do, is that we need to move from a model of people that are the same as us to embrace people that are different from us. And I say that because it's not an easy thing to do. And I'll speak about all of us that are up here. One of the things that happens in these conversations, we've talked about language a little bit. American Jews' dynamic with Israel often goes through people that speak English, people that are accessible. It's true that a lot of those other people that I'm talking about don't have English, have very little English. There's very little exposure to those worlds, to those thoughts, to those ideas that are around it. Embracing difference demands something that is extremely hard. It's to, first of all, is to lower our suspicion. Lowering our suspicion is not an easy thing to do because there's reason for suspicion. Suspicion has a place. You're worried that the other side has ulterior motives, that those sides that are seeing things not only are moving the country in a different direction, but are moving it in a direction that is self-serving and does not see your needs in that picture. So, I teach a lot that, how am I doing on time?
Yeah, we're
Close to.
about to get, yeah.
I'll try to do it 3 minutes. I teach a lot the piece of Hillel and Shammai and a vikuach l'shem shamayim, right? A debate that is worthy, is a debate in heaven, and What is a debate that's not a debate, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven? Right? It's Korach. What is the debate for l'shem shamayim? It's Shammai and Hillel. There's always a piece of Korach in these arguments, and there's always a piece of Hillel and Shammai in these arguments. How do we, so therefore, how do we have the suspicion, but not have the suspicion overwhelm three things that have to happen? The first is a sense, and Moshe talked about it, a sense of solidarity. There's a beautiful article by Buber, beautiful article, for these times. It's called Hope for This Hour. And he talks about the French Revolution. And he says there is, of course, there is liberté, equalité, and fraternité. He says liberté went to the West, equalité went to the East, he's talking about communism, and fraternité was left an orphan. The first thing is that we commit ourselves to each other. That has to be a presupposition. We don't commit ourselves with those that agree with us. We don't commit ourselves to those, it's like a family. We commit ourselves to those that we live with. That doesn't mean we agree. That doesn't mean we agree completely. That doesn't mean we're appalled at times. But we have this commitment. The second is what I call tzimtzum. We have to make room for the possibility that we are not completely right. And that if we've lowered that suspicion, then maybe there's something to learn from how somebody else sees things. Don't have to agree, don't have that, but there's something, I'm curious, I have interest. I want to know how the world looks in other people's eyes, even what they say in anthropology, right? The despicable other. I want to understand how the world looks. I want to understand how it sounds. I drop that thing in order to be able to hear those things. And the third thing, which is probably the most important, is that we understand democracy first and foremost as people that together are trying to figure out how to move forward together. When democracy becomes transactional, they're the enemy, we have to win, it's a question of the ballot box. These are the dangerous times that we are in, and these are the dangerous times we are in, not just in the United States, but also in Israel. How do we build those connections and that openness to understand that we have what to learn, we have what to explore, we have to learn. So just to end that, instead of focusing on loving the people that are like me, which is what I had and love, and will never stop loving that Israel of the 1970s. The thing that I've gone through in a very personal way is that I love the difference. I love the difference. In all its forms, in all its shapes, in all the things that infuriate me, and all the things that I embrace, and all the surprises that there are. Because people surprise.
Thank you. So I'm thrilled now to introduce Dr. Nurit Novis-Deutsch, who is an educational psychologist specializing in social cognition, values, and pedagogy. She's a lecturer at the Department of Learning and Instructional Sciences at the University of Haifa in Israel, and was previously a lecturer at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her current research interests include educating for pluralism, higher education for ultra-Orthodox Jews, Holocaust education, interdisciplinary education, and religious meaning-making. Nurit holds a PhD in psychology from the Hebrew University and was a Fulbright postdoc scholar at UC Berkeley and subsequently became a visiting lecturer there. She is very widely published, having edited 2 volumes, authored more than 40 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, academic reports, in a variety of fields and has written over 10 educational programs. She has led international research projects funded by Israel's Ministry of Education and Ministry of Science and Technology, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the Claims Conference, among others. And Nurit is a member of Kibbutz Hanaton in the Galilee. So, Nurit.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. The last time I was here, I was a 17-year-old high school student who arrived with great trepidation at the JTS to interview the then Chancellor Yizhar Hess about his take on his principles of faith. My final high school project was a set of interviews with leaders from various Jewish denominations about their theological differences and similarities. Although I didn't know it then, I had embarked on a lifelong mission to grasp the challenges of pluralism, or as Alon called it, embracing difference. This is a topic that remains compelling to me as a researcher today. And the more I engage with this elusive concept, the more convinced I am that it is simultaneously both an unattainable ideal and an essential mindset for Israelis to embrace. And I hope to convey some of the sense of the paradoxical nature of pluralism in my talk today. We'll also get to the situation in Israel and the war and the role of American Jewry. I'll try to cover it all. I'll do it through the exploration of a question that was posed to us by the organizers of this panel. Could a more pluralistic orientation towards Jewish observance among Jewish Israelis lead to a more equitable treatment of minorities? So, since the answer to this question hinges on how we define pluralism, let's begin there. So, for the US, the term pluralism is often used to connote the fact of diversity. But I would like to go the European way and distinguish between plurality and pluralism. So some countries, such as Israel and the US, include multiple sizable religious minorities, while other countries, such as Poland and Afghanistan, are more homogeneous. So in Poland, nearly 90% of the Polish are Roman Catholics. In Afghanistan, nearly 100% are Muslims. In this map, you can see the Pure Religious Diversity Index scores for these countries on a scale of 1 to 10. This is a question of plurality rather than pluralism. Pluralism, on the other hand, is a member of the ism family. So that connotes an ideological stance. Pluralism goes beyond acknowledging the fact of plurality and also beyond enabling diversity, which is the stance that we term tolerance, to actively promoting the diversity for a variety of principled reasons. People in Poland or Afghanistan can be deeply pluralistic, just as people of Israel or the US can be non-pluralistic. There are many distinctions among subtypes of pluralism, but for this talk, I'd like to highlight two of them. The first relates to who is being a pluralist, and the second relates to what they're being pluralistic about. So first, note the difference between institutional pluralism and individual pluralism. And by institutional pluralism, I mean any aspect of diversity that is regulated and supported by law, societal structure, norms, etc. By individual pluralism, I mean the personal positive attitudes of individuals towards diversity. So as an example of institutional pluralism, let's look back at that map. Israel includes over 100 religions, but of these, only 14 are state-recognized, which grants them funds and rights to conduct religious ceremonies and more. Baha'i and Druze, for example, are approved religions in Israel. Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons are not. Jewish Orthodoxy is approved. Conservative and Reform Judaism, much less. This is not too terrible a figure for a country identified with a specific religion. It's about the same as Poland. and quite a bit more than Afghanistan, which has only one permitted religion, Islam. But it is nowhere near as pluralistic as the US, where all religions are equally recognized by law. Note that we are not talking about the freedom to practice one's faith privately. That is granted by most countries today, and that reflects religious tolerance. Rather, institutional religious pluralism means that the country is saying there is something worthy and valuable about these religions. We actively support their existence. So if we were to focus on institutional pluralism, we might frame our question this way. Would granting full and equal recognition to all religious groups in Israel promote institutional pluralism in Israel towards ethnic minorities? This is an interesting question, but it's not the one I'll try to answer today. I'll return to it, however, at the end. As an educational psychologist, I focus on the second type of pluralism, individual pluralism, or attitudes held by individuals. And this brings me to the second distinction between two categories of the target of individual pluralism. When considering our own attitudes towards diversity, we can distinguish between pluralism towards groups and pluralism towards ideas. Pluralism towards groups is the positive valuation of others, groups, or people representing them. Some call this cultural pluralism. And its opposites, prejudice, ethnocentrism, racism, have been extensively studied in social psychology. But the pluralism I am more interested in has been studied less by psychologists. It is pluralism towards ideas, or the positive valuation of different sets of beliefs, attitudes, and underlying values. This can occur independently of our attitude towards the people carrying these ideas. It's the opposite of monism, and it includes what Isaiah Berlin called value pluralism, the conception that there are many different ends that people may seek and still be fully rational, capable of understanding each other and sympathizing and deriving delight from each other. But it goes beyond this to include beliefs, attitudes, ideologies, and worldviews. I think this type of pluralism is crucial because it forms the cognitive backbone of what can later become institutional pluralism. To paraphrase our question using these new terms, it would become, could higher levels of pluralism among Israelis towards religious beliefs lead to higher levels of pluralism towards ethnic groups? So that's the question I'm going to try to answer. And to test levels of idea pluralism, I use a thought experiment called the Magic Wand Survey. Let's try it. Imagine that you have a magic wand, and the property of this wand is the ability to change other people's beliefs or behaviors to closely match your own, thus erasing variance on a particular subject. So think of a hobby you really love, like playing tennis or reading Kafka. Let's say you could turn everyone with the wave of a wand into fellow hobbyists. You'll never lack a tennis player again, and your Kafka book club will be the most popular club in New York. Would you use it? I'm not risking much by betting that you wouldn't. We all learn early on that personal preference is not something to be monistic about. Let's try another example. Say you could turn everyone into believers in God, or atheists, as your preference may be. Would you use it? Would you use the wand? My guess is that most of you still would not. The US has a pretty strong tradition of religious pluralism. In Israel, I found that the more religious people are, the more likely they are to use the magic wand. What if you could make everyone vote for Kamala Harris on November 5th? Or vote for Donald Trump, as your own preference might be? And what if you could, with the wave of a wand, make everyone as conscientious about recycling, as I'm sure you all are? Would saving the earth be a good enough reason to wave that wand and forgo pluralism? You get the idea. And to the magic wand question, I always add for each scenario another question. Regardless of whether you would use the magic wand, how strongly do you believe that both alternatives are legitimate and worthy? So in studies my team and I conducted with thousands of children, teenagers, and adults in Israel, religious and secular, Arab and Jewish, for using the scale, we found first that people may be pluralistic on one set of issues, such as religion, and monistic on another, such as human rights. Second, that their areas of pluralism are strongly negatively correlated with the importance of that issue to them. So the more important it is, the less pluralist they are. Third, that when someone's sacred values are triggered, the likelihood of there being a pluralist on that matter plummets. And finally, across issues, we found group differences in the average levels of pluralism, with people from more traditional societies saying they'd be willing to use the magic wand more often. All of this implies that the answer to the question I posed before is probably not. But I will add one word to that answer, which may change its direction. Yet. Probably not yet. There's a missing ingredient in the attitude cocktail in Israel, and until we add it, the infrastructure of pluralism will be weak. My suggestion for the missing ingredient is to cultivate a skill called both and reasoning, the one expressed in the second question of my survey. I'll explain this concept through a quick story. Two men go to a rabbi, they want to settle a dispute. The rabbi listens to the first, he says, "You're right." And the second insists on being heard. So the rabbi listens to him, and he says, "You're also right." And the wife, having overheard from the kitchen, calls out, "But they can't both be right." And the rabbi reflects and nods before concluding, "And you're right too." So the rabbi was using both and reasoning, right? Both and, which underlies the generalized pluralism mindset and is opposed to either or reasoning. But the rabbi's wife raises a structural problem with both and reasoning. How can contradictory truths both be right? But that is exactly the point of cognitive pluralism. It asks us to contain this paradox, to hold space for multiple truths, and to embrace the complexity of differing perspectives. And at the same time, and this is key, to retain a committed worldview of our own. Although this mindset is quite common in traditional Judaism, for those familiar, think of Elu va'elu, Shivim panim laTorah, it is far less common in Israel today. Israel is rife with sacred values on both sides of the political and the religious divides. People who are pluralist about religion tend to be highly monistic liberals, for whom liberalism is a sacred value, while others reject religious pluralism because faith is their own sacred value. And here's what I found: when sacred values take the stage, pluralism goes out the back door. My research indicates that the thing that separates pluralists from non-pluralists is not that pluralists care less. It's their ability to be deeply committed to their community and values without sanctifying them. And that is a mindset we can teach people. Recently, I developed and tested a program in collaboration with the Tali Foundation, a foundation that promotes pluralistic Jewish identity. And the program is meant to teach students both and reasoning skills, while at the same time cultivating commitment to their Jewish identity. The program is a game-based set of lessons in which students imaginatively travel from the land of either or to the land of both and. It sounds better in Hebrew. And it focuses on learning and practicing and implementing 4 skills: perspective taking, listening and speaking from the heart, seeing value in multiple truths, and judging others positively. My research team and I tested the program in 5 schools in Israel this year. Unfortunately, just as the teacher program training program was about to start, October 7th occurred. And as you all know, Israel has been at war since. Just like sacred values, war and conflict are major threats to pluralism, as the compromised sense of security during war means that both people and institutions tend to close rank against others, and they don't have the mental capacity or the political freedom to be open-minded and embrace diversity. This was a challenge. In fact, at first we debated whether to delay implementation, But we realize that if ever there has been a time in Israel's history where pluralism and moderation were needed, it was now. By the end of the year, we were finding that the skills had been internalized by students, but mostly towards friends, classmates, and family. You can see here the high levels of understanding of two of the tools we taught, and a couple of students' reflections. So that's the good news. However, in many classes, the level of pluralism towards external others was low. Before the war, the teachers we recruited were eager to try out the educational intervention we were offering. But once the war started, they lost much of their enthusiasm. It was as if something about the idea of seeing multiple perspectives as valid became mentally challenging. One teacher said, "I've suddenly become a non-pluralist person. I don't know, I don't want to hear, I don't want to be interested. It doesn't make me curious, it just annoys me, the opinions of others." She was very honest. And another one said, "Pluralism today is a curse word in our society." And here you can see in little, not so little, unfortunately, a child's response page, an example, where he added the words "chutz me'aravim," except for Arabs, to every item on a multicultural scale, reflecting the dehumanization of enemies that takes place during war. One second here. Something moved about my slide. Second. However, no war in history has lasted forever, I hope. Our findings do give cause for hope that once the war ends, we might be able to educate students towards a pluralism based on both and reasoning. And this may eventually lead to an affirmative answer to the question of this talk. And we have no time to lose. It is critical that we, as educators, leaders, Jews, both in the United States and in Israel, begin to prepare for the post-conflict day after. The Polish poet Wisława Szymborska wrote, "After every war, someone has to clean up, tidy up. Things won't straighten themselves up, after all. And we can be those cleaners. We can do it by offering visions of a pluralist Israel, both religiously, nationally, and in many other domains." And here I pick institutional pluralism back up to end, because after the war, we will need both the institutional and the individual variants. We will need group pluralism and idea pluralism. We will need educational programs, legal programs, political strategies, ready for the day when the destruction will cease and bridge building will be required. We should make sure we have something constructive to say, to offer when that day comes. As a pluralist stuck in a very monist war, I hope that day arrives soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll turn now to our third and last panelist, Dr. Yizhar Hess, who is currently Vice Chairman of the World Zionist Organization and Senior Representative of Merkaz in the National Institutions. Following his military service, Yizhar earned a BA in Political Science and Hebrew Literature at Hebrew University. He's a member of the Israeli Bar, holds an MA in Jewish Studies and a PhD in Sociology and Education. He has a broad range of experience in Jewish communal service, including serving as Deputy Director at the Shorashim Center for Jewish Studies, the Jewish Agency's Community Shliach to Tucson, and working in Israel at the Jewish Agency as Director of Partnerships. He has professional experience in advertising and journalism and is a regular contributor to the Israeli press on the subjects of religion and state, and is co-editor of the book Questions About God. Between 2007 and 2020, Yizhar served as the CEO of the Masorti movement in Israel. He represented the Masorti movement in the negotiations with the Israeli government regarding egalitarian prayer at the Kotel, and is one of the leading voices in Israel promoting Jewish peoplehood and pluralism.
Thank you, Jen. This session's title is Liberal Zionism, Jewish Pluralism and Democracy, and each one of us tackled it from a different perspective, from a different paradigm. I'd like to give you mine. Zionism and pluralism. Many years of my life, many years of my professional career, I dedicated to the battle over Jewish pluralism in Israel. For 13 years, I was the CEO of the Masorti movement in Israel, working daily to strengthen the very simple concept that there is more than one way to be Jewish. But today I would like to speak about another basic concept, to some extent, bigger and more important than Jewish pluralism per se, although Jewish pluralism is definitely part of it. I will speak today about the undeniable connection, the vital, the critical, the authentic connection between Zionism, pluralism, and democracy. In my eyes, if one of these elements weakens or disappears, it would have terrible consequences. So let's start with Zionism and pluralism. Not by coincidence, I want to go back to the very beginning, to the first Zionist Congress that was convened in Basel, right, in Basel on August 29th, 1897. We don't know exactly how many delegates participated in the first Zionist Congress. Some say 189, some say, including Herzl, 204. While the number remains unclear, it is evident that it is not that many people to start a movement that would change Jewish history. What we do know, and it was due to this session's title, Pluralism and Democracy, what we do know is that they did not come to agree with Herzl. They knew well, all of them, Theodor Herzl's ideas, naturally. All of them read his publication, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, that was published just a year before the Congress. Yet many of them came to Basel not to agree with Herzl, but to dispute him, to argue with him. And even the ones who liked the concept in general of a Jewish state in general, they had reservations. They had their own thoughts, different approaches to Zionism. As you can imagine, Jews coming together to a conference. Was Herzl afraid of it? No. He worked tirelessly. During the 10 months he was working on the Congress, he worked tirelessly to invite to the Congress people with as many outlooks as he could, with as many approaches, and from as many places as possible. Even his biggest opponent, his #1 adversary, Asher Ginsburg, known as Echad Ha'am. Boy, how they hated each other. Even him received a special, personal, signed invitation to the Congress. Herzl understood that plurality and pluralism, I would add after hearing Nurit, that plurality and pluralism are not an obstacle, but assets. הרצל האמין שהציונות היא שם משפחה, לא שם פרטי. He believed that Zionism is not a first name, but a surname. This is institutional Zionism. And as we know, and this is important to remember, as we know, Herzl was not the first Zionist. We heard today Shuli talking about Aliyah Rishona and Chibat Zion. Herzl was not the first Zionist. Herzl did not invent Zionism. Zionism began way before him with Aliyah Rishona and with Chibat Zion. It was like 15 years before the Congress, prior to the first Zionist Congress that Herzl convened. So he didn't invent Zionism. What he did do in the first Zionist Congress, what he did do, he introduced politics. Herzl politicized the Zionist idea. He politicized the Zionist movement. What was the politics that Herzl introduced? We talked already about pluralism as a value. Now let's talk about other few important democratic values. In the first Zionist Congress, the delegates that came were invitees of Herzl. Yet, from the second Congress on, there were no more invitees. You had to be elected. The homework that the delegates received as the first Zionist Congress concluded, the homework was to go back to their cities, to their hometowns, to establish Zionist federations, to have elections. And then, if you are elected, you are invited to come to the coming Congress. In order to be a shliach tzibur, you need to have tzibur. In order to be a politician, a leader, you need to have constituency, a core element of what democracy is all about. The other democratic value was, that is very part of Zionism from the beginning, was equality between men and women. From the Second Congress on, women could vote and get elected. Can you imagine how revolutionary it was? Zionism was among the first political movements in the world that allowed women the right to vote. In the US, when was it? In the 20s. Revolutionary. When you analyze these two, the first Zionist Congress, from that perspective, the beginning of Zionism, you understand that democracy and pluralism, you understand that if you take it from the first Zionist Congress, it's not by coincidence that in the middle of Milchemet HaAtzmaut, many years later, in the middle of the Independence War in 1948, it was important enough for the leaders of the World Zionist Organization, David Ben-Gurion and others back then, it was important enough to them to have a stop, to have a short break in the war, to convene the leadership in Tel Aviv and to sign the Declaration of Independence, Megillat HaAtzmaut, the document that anchors the nature of the Jewish state yet to be born as a democracy. מדינה יהודית ודמוקרטית, דמוקרטית ויהודית, בדיבור אחד. Take these two dots in history. August 29th, 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And May 14, 1948 in Tel Aviv, Israel. Take these two dots in history. And you'll see a thick line of democratic values that connects these two dots. It makes me proud. It makes me a proud Zionist. Now I know we talked about democracy, and I look at Israel today, especially with our current government. What can I say? I will say it mildly, our democracy is not perfect. I want to acknowledge the fact that we are not the only imperfect democracy today. I take it seriously, though. Be sure I don't take it lightly. The status of our democracy is important, I think, to every Zionist. To every Zionist, I know it, I see it, I demonstrate every week in order to remind my government and to remind myself that Israel would not last if it would not be a liberal democracy. Because it's not only elections that define democracy. I'm a Zionist. I'm a devoted Zionist. I am the vice chairman of the World Zionist Congress representing Merkaz, the conservative Masorti Judaism in the Congress. So I am a serious, devoted, passionate Zionist. But I'm also a worried Zionist. Some days, even a terrified Zionist. We are in critical times. It's not only October 7th and its ripple effects. Yes, October 7th was the biggest disaster that we have known as a country. And we are still at war, and it didn't end yet, and we have 101 people still held in Gaza. Israel is not yet in a post-trauma because it is still in the midst of the trauma, and every family feels it, every individual. Alon opened his talk with mentioning it. We think about it every day. We are still in the midst of this trauma, but as much as I am worried of Israel due to October 7th, I'm almost as much worried due to October 6th. October 7th was a nightmare, but October 6th was not a paradise either. Do you remember the 10 months from January 23 till October? The awful 10 months that we were demonstrating in our streets? Tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. The biggest demonstration was of 700,000 Israelis. It's 8% of the citizens of Israel. In American terms, it's like a demonstration of 30 million in one evening. When I think about those demonstrations during the 10 months prior to October 7th, I feel pain, almost a physical pain. But also, I must admit, also some sense of pride. We demonstrated using the tools of democracy demonstrated against our government, demonstrated against our duly elected government, using every democratic tool in the box. I also find a sense of pride because of the emblem, hasemel, the emblem of these demonstrations. It was the blue and white flag. Hundreds of thousands of blue and white flags with the Star of David in the middle. That's the flag of Zionism. Almost identical, although not identical. Professor Sarna is not here, so I can say it. He talked about it this morning. Almost identical to the flag that Herzl introduced on the stage in the first Zionist Congress in Basel. It is as if Israelis felt that when it comes to the soul of their country, when the soul of the country is under a threat, the ultimately, authentically feel is to go back to the basics, the undeniable connection between Zionism and democracy. מדינה יהודית ודמוקרטית, מדינה דמוקרטית ויהודית, בדיבור אחד. Now, I'm speaking here at JTS. In a way, I'm talking about Jerusalem when I'm in Babylon, Bavel v'Yerushalayim. Is there a role for Babylon to be part of the dramatic events in Israel, in Jerusalem, post and pre-October 7th? I believe there is. I was raised as a Zionist, knowing that Israel, as a Jewish state, belongs, of course, to all Israelis, Jews and un-Jews alike, but also belongs to each and every Jew wherever he or she live. It means that wherever you like it or not, you have a skin in the game. Your connection with Israel is important. Your visits to Israel are important. Your voice is important. And at this time, more than ever before, we need your voice. We need you to speak up on things that you love in Israel. We need you to speak up on things that you don't like in Israel. We need your voice as long as you care. Loving and criticizing are not contradictions. How do I know it? It defines me. A devoted Zionist who loves Israel deeply, yet doesn't feel less Zionist when criticizing Israel's actions or policies. As we learned from Herzl, there is more than one way to be Zionist. Now, from a theoretical point of view, I want to touch to some tachlis too, if I may. Herzl left us with a gift. He taught us to look up to politics, not down. The World Zionist Congress, after successfully established the State of Israel in 1948, stayed as the only democratic platform that allows Jews from all over the world to participate in elections and influence policies and budgets in Israel. It allows Jews from all over the world not only to have a voice when it comes to Israel, but also to have a vote. Every 5 years, there are elections. The coming elections, by the way, are between March 10th to May 4th here in the US. So every 5 years there are elections. Excuse me? No, in the US. The elections to the World Zionist Congress are all over the world. In the US, it's between March 10th to May 4th. So it's like a few months from now. And the matters are at risk. The matters at risk are especially now as critical as they could be. The World Zionist Congress is responsible for some serious assets of the Jewish people, assets that do not belong to the State of Israel, that do not belong to Israelis solely, assets that belongs to all of us. It's the collective pot of the Jewish people, assets that affect billions of dollars every year. It touches, as well as money, so many issues that we are all bothered by. From rebuilding the kibbutzim and cities in the south and in the north to questions of inequality in Israeli society, matters of human rights, matters of Jewish pluralism. When you have influence on so many matters of value, and when you control so much money, you can do good and you can do bad. It's politics. It's all about politics. You know how it works. And you know it here today, I think, especially because you are running a presidential election here, and you know that not voting is actually voting. And I'm mentioning it
I
because
want to just make sure we have time for discussion.
Yeah.
So if
I'm
we
finishing
can,
in a second.
Yeah.
In the last elections, apathy almost killed us. This is what happened. Well, apathy almost killed us. I'll give you some numbers. We, Merkaz, we got 15,000 votes. The Reform did a little better. They got a little better. Their potential is bigger. And you know who did very well? When it comes to Zionism, the Haredim. They were able to mobilize to the elections 25,000 votes in the first time that they ran. And it bothers me because it reminds us that Zionism is first and foremost a call for activism. It started as a minority. We heard today in the first session that they were radicals, they were provocateurs, they were people who no one agreed with. 209 people, 204 people gathered in Basel. And it was a success. We are now in a critical times because we might be evidently seeing the change of the Zionist movement, because in the last elections, due to the elections, the results that I just shared with you, for the first time since Herzl, the more pluralistic, liberal side of Zionist thought became a minority. We cannot allow it to happen again. You know, we have many things to be proud of the state of Israel. We can be radically amazed from the achievements of the state of Israel, yet it's an ongoing process that we need to work on. The apathy almost killed us last time, and I hope that this time North American Jewry would be part of this election, and especially when it comes to conservative movement and reform movements. Toda rabba.
Thank you. So I want to bring us back to where we began, and that is the question of love. And I want to bring it back to love because part of what we want to talk about here is the love of American Jews for Israel. And that love is challenged sometimes, as love often is. And as I listened to the three of you speak, I was reminded of something that I heard from Aaron Dorfman, who is the founder and executive director of the Jewish Partnership for Democracy here. And he was enjoining us to love America, but the same applies to Israel. And what he said is that it's very hard because it's broken. And it's hard to love something that's broken. And so we have two different ways of loving. What we tend to do on the left is say it's broken, so I can't love it. And what we tend to do on the right is say, I love it, so it can't be broken. Right? And neither is effective, and neither gives us agency to help work to make it less broken. And as I listened to you, one of the challenges that jumped out at me is, Alon, you talked about the value of tzimtzum, and of course that's right. We all have to, if we're going to live together in pluralistic ways, we have to acknowledge we may be wrong. But we're talking about being wrong about things that are really sacred to us, inevitably the sacred. The maps that define the way we experience life and humanity, our religious values that we believe in whatever spectrum we are of what was revealed by God or what is created by humanity that define our Judaism and our relationship with God are the things that define our identity. So then, Nurit, you come and you tell us that, once we're in that realm, pluralism goes out the door. And I think that felt intuitively true to me and probably to most of us in the room. Add in the component of fear. It doesn't even have to be war. Any kind of fear, right? So what are the strategies for managing what is really, really challenging? This is a heavy cognitive lift, and it's a heavy lift in terms of our character and our emotional maturity, our midot. I mean, this is hard stuff. What are the strategies that we can do here to keep loving what feels broken to us, and that you can do there to sustain this? I think we have a lot to learn from each other right now.
I can jump in. I was on Long Island for 2 days over the weekend, and I took the train in to Penn Station. Let's see if you're all with me. Sunday evening at about 7 p.m. And really, there's a lot of Trump paraphernalia. I gotta say, it's like there's just like hats and shirts and, you know, socks and signs. And all of that came pouring through. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then I saw 5 Haredi girls.
You saw it?
5 Haredi girls walking out. And then I saw 3 black kippot coming out, Sephardic-looking fellows also coming out. That group is not in a crisis with Israel. It's not broken for them. And for liberals, there isn't a crisis with liberal Israel. That was what was so exciting about the protests. That's why it became, in certain ways, a rite of passage for people. Broken. Oh, here's the Israel that I know. Here's the Israel that I love. The crisis is not between Israel and American Jews. The crisis is between liberal Jews and non-liberal Jews. That's the crisis, right? And it plays itself out within Israel. It plays itself out between Israel and American Jewry. It plays itself out, by the way, not only in the Jewish context. And it plays itself out in a way, I would suggest to all of you, also within the Jewish community. In my mind, Israel is farther along in this because it's so obvious that you've got all of these groups. But in the American Jewish situation, I think that sense that the American Jewish community is the liberal community, and then it allows it to hide from the rest of the people that are there. I haven't yet given it an answer, but I'm just giving a context to what that is. The leap of faith that I've done is that let's lower the volume and you will be surprised. Mm-hmm. Not in all cases, not in all senses. It's not all about dialogue. It's not all about that. But there's a decency, right? It's a phrase that I love by George Orwell, common decency. There's a decency that is out there. You're saying that there's all this hurt and pain? Everybody's got the hurt and pain. Right. When the liberal camp starts talking about the pain, I say something that's difficult to hear. Welcome to the club. It's been being felt, all of it. It's amazing. It's amazing to sit with people. It's so obvious to each side where the pain is and where the pain isn't. In all places that are around that. And I'm not even talking about Jews and Arabs, right? We're very involved in the Arab community. Very involved. It's everybody that's involved in this, that's touching it. But if you tzimtzum, and if you open up your heart, and if you listen, right? There's not always, there's not in every situation, but there is a lot, the places that I have been, right? Shas and the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, right? 2 unlikely bedfellows, right? We worked together for 2 years. Every 6 weeks we got together. And the seminars, there was so much warmth in the room for one another. That doesn't mean that they agreed on everything. That doesn't mean that they but there was a sense of, we're not ogres. We care about each other. We care about this country. We can agree on a lot of things, more than we thought we could. And the places that we can't agree become hard, scary, but somehow less ominous. Mm-hmm. I have more to say about it, but I'll let someone say it.
Nurit, did you want to weigh in on this question? Is there...
I think to me the answer is, you're raising a very complicated picture with a lot of internal contradictions. And I think the thing that can hold internal contradictions together is a sense of complexity and the ability to hold that complexity. We have 12 years to educate every child in Israel, but everywhere in the world, to be able to do that, to love who they are, but not also despise people who are not like them. It's possible to hold those things together. We need to think about how to focus our education on this ability to be self-critical and not other-critical, and how to be empathic to others and not only hold on to some sort of competitive victimhood like we do right now. And I'll end by, I remember two lines from a poet by Yehuda Amichai. He says, I'll try to translate, the place that we are right is a place where nothing grows. And I think there's something to be said for that.
Yep.
Yeah. David, do you want to?
Yes, I see things here a little differently, and I must say it with a beginning that I'm a liberal and a pluralist, and we all feel that pluralism is definitely a value that we should protect. This is who we are. But I think, Alon, that we cannot be confused. There is a line that we cannot cross. You talked about taking the flames down, and so the tzimtzum, and let's talk to each other. There are things that I'm not considered to negotiate. Racism is not something that I could tolerate. I think that the state of Israel could not tolerate. Not everyone is a fair partner for a true dialogue. I can dialogue with Aryeh Deri from Shas, definitely. I can dialogue with Ayman Uda, definitely. They don't hold my views. I cannot dialogue with Itamar Ben-Gvir. And if Itamar Ben-Gvir is what Zionism is, we are losing the state of Israel. And I'm afraid from the quiet that you give me. You look down on the demonstrators as if they are playing Woodstock. No, they are not. We are running to defend our country in the most genuine way, in the ways that democracy, that liberal democracy gave us. And I'm afraid from different versions of democracy. I'm afraid from selling myself because I don't want to rock the boat. I'm afraid from selling myself that places like Turkey or Poland or Hungary, where they have elections, that these are democracies. I'm not willing for Israel to be one of these countries because I believe that Israel would not last. It won't be only a place that I will not be able to live in and not my children. Israel would not last. From any perspective, it would not last. And I think, therefore, that this approach of hugging, to some extent, cannot cross a very firm line that sometimes it's too black to cross.
I don't have an argument about Ben-Gvir. I don't think the question is an argument about, what we think about Ben-Gvir. I think the question is, what do we think about the Israeli public?
Israel?
The Israeli public, right? We have morphed into a culture war, which I don't have to tell you about, because America is in a culture war right now, and it goes very deep. And how do you move away from that precipice? That is the question. Right? So it doesn't help me to say that I'm going to fight and I'm going to battle and I'm going to draw my lines if doing that does not allow us to heal. Because without healing, nothing's going to happen. We'll be right, but we're not going to come away from the precipice. I am suggesting that there's another way, and I would like to one of my heroes recently is Abraham Lincoln. I want to say something about Lincoln, apropos of the lines. Abraham Lincoln was no big friend of the abolitionists. He wasn't. People knew that he was against slavery. He also knew that he was a politician, and he was figuring out how to do that. But I just want to read three quotes. Why Lincoln? Quickly, we have this new leadership program. We brought them to Washington, D.C. We landed in Newark. We took them on the bus. The first place we went was to Gettysburg to talk about this. He had the line when he was still senator, right? A house divided cannot stand. He understood that. He said in his first inaugural address, "We are not enemies." We're talking about the slavery South. Right? Ben-Gvir is nothing compared to the slavery South. We are not enemies. Right? Though the passions of the moment distance us, we will hold on. And then in his second inaugural address, several weeks before he was assassinated, he says, with malice towards none. He's talking about the South. He probably would have done the Marshall Plan. Instead, we got Versailles, and the rest of it is history. The book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, A Team of Rivals. He put together pro-slavery people in his party, but pro-slavery, neutral, anti-slavery, and that was the people because he wanted to hear all the voices and make decisions based on that. There's a politics around this. He was brave. He didn't get stuck. We are in a moment at the precipice. We have to challenge our demons, have to challenge them, and have to find ways of reaching out and across without, thousands of people vote for Ben Gvir. I was told, by the way, that Naftali Bennett was a Jewish supremacist. People change. Circumstances affect things. We need to make spaces for ourselves and for others to change.
So there is no
without giving, no, it's not voting for them. It's not putting them into government. It's not none of that. It is to listen to how the world feels towards those, and then you take it with what you take it with. You can be as disgusted by after those kinds of questions. It's not important to him. I'm worried about the amount of people that are voting where. I'm worried about how do you build a population that the center can hold, It's not going to work with culture wars. It's just not. We have to recognize that, and we have to be brave. There's so many precedents for this kind of thought. There's so many historical examples. I used Lincoln, I talked about Orwell, and on. Real people doing real politics in the world that had a softer brush, that are less worried about the red lines, more worried about how do we heal.
So there's much to say about this. I would love to follow up on this, but I see we have questions that we want to, yes, no? I'm sorry?
What does it look like? What's the, Dr. Schwarz, I don't need to stand up, it's okay. But
And introduce yourself.
Shalom lekulchem. I just want to understand, Dr. Schwarz, I hear you on the courage, and I hear you on the practicality of further entrenching polarization. And I want to understand, how do we get from here to, how does your approach look in tachlis? What are you proposing then we say in our sermons? What are you proposing, I spoke about WZO elections in my sermon, and one of the ways that I was trying to encourage people to vote was by explaining to them how important it is that our values are represented, and I had to speak about the sides. Meanwhile, I was also speaking about Big Tent and Amut and healing. And somebody said to me, Rabbi, I appreciate this, but what do we do? Somebody asked me a question along the lines of what you're saying. And I think there's a moment for fighting and there's a moment for healing. So I'm just trying to understand your roadmap for that.
I will not give any satisfactory answer, but I'll give two images quickly. First of all, in certain ways, the short-lived government of change that took place with Naftali Bennett as the prime minister was a window into people that have deeply different political orientations coming together. And I had a foundation that when I walked in after the election, they said, you guys did this. You guys caused this. You made this government happen, which is a ridiculous idea. But the ideas behind what we were talking about were there. It fell apart also because of people that are connected to us. It's not a simple story. On the local level, I can name you 15 mayors today that are mayors of towns that ran exactly on what we're talking about, on bringing people together, on crossing the lines of difference, on finding support, across these lines, to bring those things together. It's not disconnected from the real world and real things that happen. The Israeli political map, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where it's going, but I will say right now, at this moment in time, we are in a war, and wars tend to make a population more extreme. All polls show that the population has moved more to the center than it had before. All the polls show that, right? You know, you can talk about Gantz, you can talk about Lapid, you can talk about, you know, various personalities that are in there. We can have a discussion about where Bennett sits on that spectrum and where he doesn't. But Ben Gvir has not gained power. Smotrich is underneath the threshold that's around it. You would expect those things to be burgeoning out. They're not. They might still. It's unclear where it's going to go, but they have 12 seats today. Polls are showing somewhere between 6 and 8 around that. And the same goes true the other side. So I think that the country, in spite of social media, which plays to these extremes around it, people are more balanced, tired of the culture wars, move to the center, not completely, not around, I don't want to do a whitewash on it, right? But there are signs within Israeli society that that people understand this stuff. The amount of initiatives that are crossing the aisle in this country today, right? Between religious right, secular left, the kibbutzim, the itnachuyot that are around there, a lot of stuff that has happened between them that are around that. It's a feeling that's out there. It's not the only feeling that's out there, right? The culture wars are always pulling apart. But there's a lot of empirical data to suggest that these are real things and they're possible in the world. And it's dependent on us as well.
You wanted to respond?
I'd like to follow Alon. I wish that many of your assumptions were working, and it's not that I don't get it from its essence. We are a centrist movement. You know, the center should hold Israel, no doubt. The question is, how do we get there, and what do we lose if we do not make sure to put lines on things that are not acceptable? You say Israel moved to the center. In a way, after Israel moves to the center, but Israel in the last 30, 40 years moved dramatically to the right. You know, things that we couldn't tolerate a decade ago, like things that extreme settlers are doing in the territories, were headlines a decade ago. And today we look the other line, because we know that the political arm of these very settlers is sitting in the government. And it's in any way okay for us to come and hug and think about building a center with them. I think that in order to create a center, you need to remember that you need to be very critical about what you don't do and whom you don't negotiate with. And this is so we are in agreement of 90%, the 10% that we don't agree of, it's a dramatical 10%. You gave us some historical evidence. Should we look on other historical evidence of democracies who didn't make sure to maintain their strength as democracies and became not democratic countries?
So, Nurit, I wanted to pick up on something that you had said, perhaps in response to this, because you pointed us to the way that we are pluralist about some things and not others, pluralistic, and the difference between being pluralistic about ideas and being pluralistic about people, right? Is there a possibility here that as we work to recognize the complexity within ourselves, the inner contradictions within ourselves, that we can perhaps open the door to approaching other people, distinguishing between the ideas and behaviors that are over the line and the people that are over the line, and perhaps opening the door to the possibility that other people might be every bit as complex and contradictory as I am, right? Do you see that is that part of the educational, is there hope in that?
I think there is. I kind of feel like that rabbi that feels like you're right and you're right too, and I know it's hard to hold them both together. I think maybe actually not, maybe instead of using only ideas and people, we could also just think of institutional and personal pluralism. Personal pluralism, we should try to work within each of ourselves to become as pluralistic to the possible maximum. We're always going to have parts of us that stop us. We don't have to be worried about that. Institutionally, that's another very interesting question, which I think you've heard two sides about. Institutions have to protect themselves. Individuals should work on finding the place of love and containment. I think eventually one will influence the other.
I think we have time for one. Yeah.
Hi. We have the same kind of issues here in the United States, as you noted.
We have noticed.
Broadly, as well as in the American Jewish community. So you have many Jews, mostly younger Jews, but Jews of all ages, who are not anti-Semites, who are not self-hating Jews, who basically feel that the best way to help Israel is to promote a ceasefire, to promote an arms embargo against Israel, to promote a nonviolent boycott of goods from Israel, right? They happen to overlap with anti-Semites and from time to time. But they're also allies of Palestinian Americans. I'm wondering if, from afar, from Israel, you can kind of comment about what we should be doing here in the United States about this. How do we, interact with the people who have those views so we don't just turn them into non-Zionists or anti-Zionists?
Anyone want to pick that up?
Oh, you're passing this one on to me?
Whoever wants to.
I think that we are in agreement on that, but please.
It is true that I spend a lot less time thinking about that question, right? It's not front and center in my thought. You're talking about young Jews, I think that the Jewish community needs to find ways of, and this is sort of like the conversation we were just having, right? To embrace, but also to say things. Not to be a blank slate about this, right? And they're your kids, right? It's very personal. I have a slew of friends that, are struggling with these questions with their own kids and where they stand. It's not a simple thing, but I think that, based on everything that I just said, I feel like there has to be a way of engaging. There has to be a way of engaging without legitimizing, but engaging. Engaging and listening. It's like, why is everyone so scared about listening?
I agree that we should keep as wider tent as possible to whomever is willing to conduct that kind of conversation. There are, when I go to campuses, and whenever I go to Hillel, they have me meet the most Zionist students that are there because I'm the vice chair of the World Zionist Congress. And of course, I'd like to meet others that are not necessarily associated with Zionism. Some of them would not meet with me, but if they would have, even if they would hold the most extreme radical ideas, I would meet them because of the very simple fact that we need to remember that not everyone needs to be Zionists. We hope that they would, but history of Zionism proved us that it's not that always Jews everywhere were Zionists. And I do differentiate between criticizing Israel even severely and anti-Semitism. Okay, and once you do not cross that line, I'm willing to discuss in any way a serious dialogue with you.
Just want to say one more thing quickly. Sorry. We have an Arab program, and we have two Palestinian Arab Israelis that lead the program. And in the last staff meeting, like about a month ago, I said to them beforehand, I said, please tell us what you're feeling now. And they spoke, the two of them, about 50 minutes. They talked about how appalled they are at what Israel is doing. They talked about what is it like to be an Israeli Arab at this moment in the war, scared to say anything. And they talked for 45 minutes. Our group, by the way, is a plurality of political views. And when they were finished, they said to me, Alon, you realize this was the first time in over a year that I was able to, in a Jewish setting, to say what I feel without fear that something was going to happen to me because I said it. And then they hugged me. People need to be able to have their own. I didn't agree with them with what their analysis was. I didn't agree with what they thought. I didn't agree with them with so many things. But I saw them. And I trust them as people. I don't know, that's...
So we need to wrap up. I want to thank you all so much, and I want to close with just one personal note as an American and as a rabbi. I've been struggling over the last number of years with watching American democracy, and I've been increasingly aware that our focus here on civil rights has become so problematic. That because on civil rights, because we focus on the rights and we lose the civil and we lose the civic, right? And one of the things I think we can learn both from Jewish tradition and from Israel is the sense of not only rights, but mutual responsibility, of arivut. And also, you spoke about pluralism and tolerance. I want to throw in the concept of graciousness, of chen,
Yep.
of generosity of spirit that I think we saw from all of you. And I'm so grateful that you're all doing the work you're doing. I know we all are. And we're going to learn just a little bit about our next session before we close. So thank you so much.